The station agent held the crate at arm's length, the way a man holds something he wants no part of. The smell came first, sour feathers, wet straw gone to rot, and underneath it the sweet thickness of birds that had already died in transit. Through the pine slats, bills opened and closed on nothing. A boy beside the water barrel covered his nose. A woman with a market basket crossed to the far side of the platform without looking back. The man with the limp did not cross to the far side. He stood over the crate for a long time, listening to the sound the dying birds made, a low rasp that was not quite a quack, and then he opened a tobacco tin and counted out coins that represented more than half of everything he owned. The summer of 1874 had already taken more than it gave by the time Ira Bellamy stood on the platform at Worthington Station, watching a crate of dying ducks that nobody wanted. He was 36. He walked with a limp that worsened in damp weather, a souvenir from a piece of Confederate iron that had buried itself near his left knee outside Vicksburg 11 years before. He had a quarter-section claim in Nobles County, southwestern Minnesota. 160 acres of low prairie grass, a sod house with 3 walls finished and a 4th held together by willpower and stacked turf, and a niece named Liddy who was 9 years old and had been sent west after her mother died of typhoid in Illinois. Liddy had arrived in May with a flour sack dress and a look in her eyes that said she understood more about death than any child should. The claim was supposed to be a beginning. Union veterans could deduct their years of service from the homestead residency requirement, and Ira had 3 years and 4 months of war to subtract. That meant less time before the land became his. But less time did not mean less work. It meant the same brutal labor compressed into fewer seasons with fewer dollars and fewer hands. He had 12 acres of spring wheat, planted late because the sod breaking had taken longer alone. 4 acres of oats that looked thin even before the heat set in. A kitchen garden where Liddy tended beans and squash with the focus of someone who understood that food came from dirt, or it did not come at all. 1 milk cow that was drying up because the grass near the slough had gone brown, and $8.70 in a tobacco tin that represented everything standing between his household and hunger. The math was simple and cruel. He needed 20 bushels of grain to survive the winter, flour for bread, seed for spring, and enough left to barter for salt pork, lamp oil, and nails. 12 acres of spring wheat, if it all came in clean and the weather held, might yield 15 to 18 bushels. The oats could add 6 or 7. That was close. Close enough to try, not close enough to feel safe, but close only mattered if the crop stood long enough to cut. Whitcomb Pike arrived at Ira's claim on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of July. Pike was 58, thick through the shoulders, with a beard trimmed square and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak he used for fence posts. He had been the county's unofficial agricultural authority for 6 years, not by election, but by the simple fact that he had farmed longer than anyone else in the settlement and had buried fewer crops than most. When Pike spoke about wheat, men listened. When Pike said a field was finished, men believed him. He walked Ira's 12 acres without being invited. He stopped at the northwest corner where the wheat was thinnest, crouched, and pulled ahead. He rolled the kernels between his thumb and forefinger, held them to his nose, and dropped them in the dirt. "You planted too late," Pike said. Ira said nothing. He knew. "The stand is thin on this whole quarter. You have maybe 10 bushels in the ground if every head fills and nothing touches it." Pike straightened and looked west, where the horizon shimmered in heat that made the grass seem to breathe. "And something is going to touch it." "I have heard the talk," Ira said. "It is not talk." Pike pulled a glass jar from his coat pocket. Inside, 3 red-legged grasshoppers crawled over each other, tapping the glass with their mandibles. A freight man brought these from a siding west of here. Said the rails were slick with them for 2 miles. Ira looked at the jar. The insects were large, nearly 3 inches, with banded legs and wings folded tight against their backs. Rocky Mountain locusts. He had heard the name spoken in the store, in the road, at the well, always spoken low, the way men talked about cholera or fire. How long? Ira asked. Could be a week, could be a month, could miss us entirely. But if it comes, Bellamy, you understand what happens. Pike gestured at the wheat. This goes, all of it, every head, every stalk, every leaf. They eat the grain, they eat the chaff, they eat the stems down to dirt. I have seen it once before, in '68 south of here. A man went to fetch water and came back to bare ground. Looked like someone had shaved the earth. Pike put the jar back in his coat. He looked at the sod house, at the missing 4th wall covered with a horse blanket, at Liddy sitting on an overturned bucket shelling dried peas into a tin bowl. You need men, Pike said. Men with scythes, men with tar pans, men with ropes. You need to cut early and stack high and cover the shocks with wet blankets and pray the wind does not blow. That is how you save wheat from hoppers. Hands, iron, speed. I do not have men, Ira said. Then you do not have wheat. Pike adjusted his hat. I'm not saying it to be cruel. I'm saying it because you are a veteran and you deserve the truth before you waste another week on a field that will feed insects instead of that child. He left without looking back. His boot prints stayed in the dry path for 3 days before the wind filled them. That night, Ira sat on the dirt floor of his sod house with the tobacco tin open on his knee. $8.70. Liddy was asleep on the straw tick, her breathing slow and even, one hand curled around a wooden spoon she'd carried from Illinois. The lamp threw shadows that made the sod walls look like they were closing in. Pike was right. About the wheat. About the men. About the math. A single man with a bad knee could not scythe 12 acres fast enough to beat a swarm. He could not build tar pans and smoke fires and drag ropes and stack shocks and guard them all at once. The numbers did not work. They had never worked. He had planted the wheat knowing the odds were poor and the soil was new and the season was short, and he had done it anyway because the alternative was to sit in a half-built house and wait for winter to decide whether he and Liddy lived or died. The alternative was still the alternative. If the wheat went, he could sell the cow. Maybe get $4 for her, dry as she was. He could hire out on the railroad crew and leave Liddy with a family in town. Strangers, people he did not know, people who might be kind or might not. He could abandon the claim and walk east and try to find work in a city where a limping veteran with no trade was worth less than the clothes he wore. None of those choices kept Liddy fed and safe and in a place that could become home. He closed the tin. He did not sleep. The ducks arrived 3 days later on the afternoon freight from Sioux City. Ira had not gone to the station looking for poultry. He had gone to price nails. He needed to finish the 4th wall before the weather turned, and nails cost money he could not afford to spend. But the station agent, a thin man named Cowell, who wore his spectacles on a string and spoke in numbers, was standing beside a wooden crate on the platform with the expression of a man who had been handed someone else's problem. Shipper defaulted, Cowell said. Supposed to go to a buyer in Mankato who never showed. Railroad says I can sell them or dump them. Nobody wants them. The crate was 3 feet by 4, built from rough pine slats, and it smelled like a swamp that had been left in the sun. Inside, packed so tight they could barely turn, were ducks. Not the fat white pecans that were starting to appear in the eastern markets, and not the sleek birds Ira had seen in illustrated papers. These were mixed-breed farmyard ducks, some dark, some mottled, some with the greenish-black sheen of cayuga stock, some with pale bills and muddy plumage that suggested they had been bred for quantity rather than quality. They were thin. Several could not stand. Their bills were crusted, their eyes half closed, and the feathers along their breasts were matted with droppings and straw. "How many?" Ira asked. "Manifest says 212. I would guess 10 or 15 are dead already. You can smell which ones." A boy watched from beside a water barrel, mouth open. A woman passing with a market basket glanced at the crate and walked faster. "What do you want for them?" Ira said. Cowell looked at him as though he had asked the price of the moon. "Bellamy, these birds are not worth hauling off the platform. Take them for $3 and do us both a favor." Ira reached into his coat and removed the tobacco tin. He counted out $5 silver, more than half of everything he owned, and placed them on the platform railing. "5," Ira said, "for the crate and the birds and the straw?" Cowell stared at the coins. "That is too much." "I know." "You understand these ducks are half dead." "I can see that." "Bellamy." Cowell lowered his voice. "I do not pretend to know your business, but you have a child on that claim and winter coming and wheat that might not make it. $5 is a month of lamp oil. $5 is 20 pounds of salt pork. $5 is what I am paying," Ira said. "Help me load the crate." They loaded it into the back of Ira's borrowed wagon, the only vehicle he had, lent by a railroad worker who owed him for a fence repair. The ducks shifted and pressed against each other, and the ones that could still move made a low, raspy sound that was not quite a quack. It sounded like complaint or exhaustion, or the noise an animal makes when it has stopped expecting anything good. Ira drove the wagon back to his claim at a walk to keep the crate from sliding. By the time he arrived, the sun was low, and Liddy was standing by the well with a bucket, watching him come up the track with a look that mixed curiosity and wariness in equal measure. "What is in the box?" she asked. "Ducks." Liddy set the bucket down. She walked to the wagon and looked through the slats. A dark duck pressed its bill against the wood, and Liddy touched it with one finger. "They look sick," she said. "They are." "Are they going to die?" Ira pulled the crate to the tailgate. "Not if we work." The memory came that night while Ira was mixing grain mash in a feed trough he had built from a split log. It was not a dramatic recollection. It was not a revelation that arrived with thunder and light. It was the smell, sour grain, and damp feathers, and something fermenting underneath that pulled him back to the summer of 1863, outside Vicksburg, in the weeks after the siege broke. He had been a hospital orderly by then, too lame for infantry after the shrapnel, but still useful enough to haul stretchers and boil bandages and do the work that no one wanted to do. The army camp sprawled along the river bluffs, and the supply situation was a catastrophe of rot. Flour barrels had been sitting in heat and river damp for weeks. Weevils threaded through the hardtack. Beetles clustered so thick on the salt pork that the surface seemed to move. A quartermaster's helper. Ira remembered him as a wiry man from Indiana with a gap in his front teeth and hands always stained with grease, had solved part of the problem with ducks. Camp ducks, ugly, mean-tempered birds that someone had traded from a farm upriver. The Indiana man kept them penned behind the commissary tent, and every morning he dragged a board aside and let the flock loose on the worst of the spoiled provisions. Ira had watched the ducks work. That was the only word for it. They did not wander. They did not explore. They went straight for the beetles, the maggots, the larvae buried in rotting grain, and they ate with a focus that was mechanical and relentless. Their bills hit the surface like small hammers, tap, 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 and what had been a crawling mess was clean within an hour. Not spotless, but manageable. The insects that had been multiplying in the heat were gone, converted into duck meat and eggs that the quartermaster's helper traded for tobacco and writing paper. The lesson was not that ducks were magic. Any fool could see that birds ate insects. The lesson was about concentration. The ducks worked hardest where the insects were thickest. They did not chase individual bugs across an open field. They descended on the worst spots and cleaned them out before moving on. If you could control where the insects gathered, you could control where the ducks fed. And if you could control where the ducks fed, you could protect what mattered. Ira looked at his wheat field in the dark. 12 acres he could not guard alone. An incoming swarm he could not stop, could not fight, could not outrun. 190-odd half-dead ducks that could barely stand up. But if the ducks recovered, if they learned to work the field margins, if he could funnel insects into feeding lanes and let the birds do what birds did naturally, eat, then maybe he did not need to save 12 acres. Maybe he needed to save the edges, the first 10 feet, then the next 10, strip by strip, lane by lane, not trying to stop the sky, but trying to control the ground. The idea was thin. He knew that. It depended on birds that might die, on a method he had only seen used against beetles in a commissary tent, on timing he could not control, and on labor that would have to come from a man with a bad knee and a 9-year-old girl. Pike's voice echoed in his head. You do not have men. He did not have men. He had ducks. The risk calculation was brutal and clear. Feeding the ducks to health would cost grain, the very grain he was trying to save. Every cup of mash he mixed for the birds was a cup that would not become bread. If the ducks died anyway, or if they recovered but could not patrol fast enough, or if the swarm came before the flock was ready, he would have spent his last $5 and burned through his grain reserves for nothing. He would be worse off than if he had done nothing at all. But doing nothing meant waiting for the cloud and watching his wheat disappear. Doing nothing meant Pike was right. And Pike being right meant the wagon, the railroad, and Liddy with strangers. Ira kept mixing the mash. Nora Dinsmore came to the fence the next afternoon. She was 32, widowed since the previous winter, when her husband had fallen through thin ice on the Des Moines River and not come up. She had 2 sons, Caleb, 12, and Owen, 10, and a claim that shared a property line with Ira's on the south. Her wheat was planted earlier and stood taller, and she had oats and a garden that she tended with the grim efficiency of a woman who knew exactly what stood between her family and hunger. Nora watched the ducks for a long time without speaking. Ira had moved them from the crate into a shallow pen he had built from willow stakes and twine, and he was crouching beside a trough of grain mash mixed with water, trying to coax the weakest birds to eat. Several ducks were lying on their sides in the shade of a piece of canvas he had rigged between 2 posts. Others were standing but swaying, their bills opening and closing on nothing. Bellamy, Nora said. What are you doing? Ira did not look up. Feeding ducks. I can see that. I am asking why you are feeding ducks when you should be sharpening your cradle and cutting that wheat before the hoppers take it. The wheat is not ready. It is closer to ready than those birds are to useful. Ira lifted a duck that had toppled sideways and set it upright near the trough. It took 2 steps, dipped its bill, and drank. They eat insects, he said. If I can get them strong enough and get them into the field margins before the swarm hits, they can reduce the feeding pressure on the standing crop. Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the field, then at the ducks, then back at Ira. 200 birds, she said, cannot guard 12 acres. Not 12, the first 10 feet, then the next 10. Ira, She used his first name, which she rarely did. I am not laughing at you. I want you to understand that. But I have seen grasshoppers. My husband saw them in '68. He said they piled 3 inches deep on the ground and ate the paint off the wagon. 200 ducks cannot fight that. I am not trying to fight it. I am trying to slow it down on my edges long enough to cut and stack what matters. Nora shook her head slowly, not in mockery, in the careful way a person shakes their head when they want to believe something but cannot find the math to support it. You are feeding them your own grain, she said. Yes. The grain you need for winter. Yes. She looked at the ducks again. One of the dark ones, a cayuga-looking bird with feathers that caught green in the light, had found a grasshopper in the dirt near the trough and was hammering it against the ground with its bill. Tap, tap, tap. The insect stopped moving. The duck swallowed it whole. Nora watched the bird for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back toward her claim without another word. The town learned about the ducks the way towns learned about everything, through talk that traveled faster than fact. Bennett Thorne heard about it first. Thorne was 44, the owner of the general store, the holder of most settlers' credit accounts, and the man who quietly bought distress claims when families could not make the payments. He was not tall, not loud, not visibly cruel. He wore a clean collar and kept his ledger in ink that never smudged. His power came from the simple fact that every family in the settlement owed him something: nails, lamp oil, salt pork, seed, flour, and that he remembered every debt the way a preacher remembered scripture. Ira owed Thorne for nails, lamp oil, and a quarter barrel of salt pork he had bought on account in May. The total was $4.11. If Ira abandoned the claim, Thorne could petition for the improvements and resell the quarter section to the railroad landmen who were buying up every failed homestead they could find. A failed claim with a sod house and broken ground was worth more than raw prairie. Thorne did not need Ira to fail, but Ira's failure would not cost him sleep. Bellamy bought feathers when he needed flour. The line appeared at the store counter on a Wednesday morning. No one remembered who said it first, but everyone remembered Thorne repeating it with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes. By Thursday, it had traveled to the well, the smithy, and the church steps. By Friday, children were waddling through the road outside the store, flapping their arms and quacking. Thorne visited the claim on Saturday. He arrived in a buggy, which he used to remind people of the difference between his situation and theirs. He tied the horse to Ira's fence post, a gesture that assumed permission, and walked the field edge until he found the duck pen. Several of the birds were standing now, which was an improvement. A few were walking the perimeter of the pen with a wobbly, determined gait, but many were still huddled under the canvas shade, and the smell was sharp: grain mash, droppings, and the sweet rot of the 3 birds that had died overnight and had not yet been removed. Thorne looked at the pen. He looked at Liddy, who was carrying a bucket of water from the well with both hands, her face red with effort. "Girl," Thorne said, "those birds will be bones by Sunday." Liddy set the bucket down. She looked at Thorne with the flat expression of a child who had already learned that adults said things they could not back up. "They ate 4 grasshoppers this morning," she said. "I counted." Thorne smiled the half-smile again and turned to Ira, who was splitting willow branches for hurdles near the sod house. "Bellamy, I came to talk about your account." "My account is current through September," Ira said without looking up. "Current assumes income. Your wheat looks thin, your oats look worse, and your investment strategy appears to involve poultry." Thorne adjusted his cuffs. "I am not trying to pressure you. I'm offering to settle the account now if you prefer. Cash for the improvements, release on the debt, and I will see that the girl gets placed with a family in town." Ira's hand stopped on the willow. He looked up at Thorn, and something moved behind his eyes that was not anger exactly, but something older and colder. The look of a man who had spent 3 years watching other men calculate who would live and who would not. The account is current through September, Ira said again. I will settle it with grain. If you have grain. I will have grain. Thorn stood there a moment longer, his clean boots dark against the dry dirt. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he has made a note in a ledger that no one else can see, and walked back to his buggy. Ira went back to splitting willow. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the effort of keeping his voice level while his knee throbbed and his ribs ached, and $5 sat in a duck pen instead of in the tobacco tin where they could have bought Liddy salt pork for the winter. That evening, someone left a dead crow on the fence post where Thorn had tied his horse. The message was crude but legible. Dead birds for a dead bet. Ira removed the crow and buried it behind the sod house. Liddy watched him from the doorway, but did not ask who had left it. She was learning the grammar of the settlement, the language of approval and punishment that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with what appeared on your fence in the morning. The first hurdle went up the next day. Ira cut willow from the slough bank where the branches grew thick and whippy. He hauled them in bundles, his knee protesting every trip, and stripped them with a drawn knife until they were smooth enough to lash with twine. Each hurdle was roughly 4 feet high and 6 feet long, not tall enough to stop anything determined, but enough to create a wall the ducks would follow instead of crossing. The design came from memory and logic, not from any book. He had seen the Indiana man at Vicksburg use boards to channel the camp ducks toward the worst of the spoiled grain. The principle was the same. Ducks moved forward when the sides were blocked, and something they wanted waited ahead. If he cut narrow lanes through the outer wheat, paths roughly 12 feet wide, and lined them with hurdles, the ducks would move down the lanes like water through a channel. Insects shaken from the wheat would fall into the lanes. The ducks would eat them. The first lane took 6 hours. Ira cut the wheat on both sides of a 12-foot strip along the northwest edge, where Pike had said the stand was thinnest. The cut stalks he gathered and bound into sheaves and stacked in a shock pile near the sod house. The standing wheat on either side of the lane bent inward slightly, closing the gap above, which meant the lane was shaded, and shade was where grasshoppers dropped when the sun went behind clouds. He placed the hurdles every 20 paces. Between each pair, he set a shallow water pan made from a tin plate hammered flat with a stone. At the end of the lane, he put a feed trough with grain mash. Then he opened the pen and released 20 ducks. The birds stood in the open air for a full minute, blinking. Several sat down immediately. Others turned in circles. One began walking toward the sod house and had to be redirected with a gentle push from Ira's boot. Then a cayuga duck, the same dark bird Nora had watched killing a grasshopper, walked into the lane. It stopped, its head tilted. Something moved in the wheat stubble. The duck's bill struck the ground so fast Ira did not see it until the grasshopper was already disappearing down the bird's throat. The second duck followed, then a third. Within 5 minutes, the 20 ducks were strung along the lane, their bills working the ground, and the low wheat stems with a focus that Ira recognized. The same mechanical intensity he had seen in the camp behind Vicksburg. But only 20, and only one lane, and the wheat was still weeks from cutting, and the swarm could arrive any day, and the other 170 ducks were still too weak to walk 50 feet without collapsing. Ira leaned against a hurdle and pressed his hand against his knee. The joint was swollen again, hot under his palm. He had been on his feet since before dawn, and the sun was only now touching the tops of the wheat on the eastern edge. The day was not half over. He had 9 more lanes to build, Liddy appeared at the end of the lane with a water bucket. She had tied her hair back with a piece of flour sacking, and she was wearing boots 2 sizes too large that had belonged to Ira's wife. "How many lanes?" she asked. "10, if I can cut enough willow." "How many ducks per lane?" 20. She did the arithmetic in her head, the way children do, moving her lips slightly, her eyes fixed on a middle distance that contained only numbers. "That is all of them," she said, "if enough get better." "Yes." "What if they do not get better?" Ira looked at the 20 ducks in the lane. They had already moved 30 feet, cleaning the ground behind them like a slow, feathered broom. Ahead of them, grasshoppers clung to the wheat stems, unaware that anything had changed. "Then we do it with fewer ducks and more lanes and less sleep," Ira said. "Help me carry the hurdles." They worked until the light failed. By evening, 2 lanes were finished and staked, and the 20 ducks were back in the pen, their crops visibly full for the first time since they had arrived. Ira counted the flock by lantern light. He had lost 2 more, a mottled hen that had not moved all day, and a pale drake whose breathing had gone raspy at noon and stopped by supper. 188 ducks alive, 12 acres of wheat standing, 10 lanes needed, and somewhere beyond the western horizon, a sound that might have been wind and might have been something else entirely. If you have ever been laughed at for building something no one else understood, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Because Ira Bellamy had just reached the point where quitting would have been easier than continuing. The heat did not break that week. It sat on the prairie like a hand pressing down, and the wheat heads drooped under it, and the oats turned a color that Ira did not like. A yellow that was not ripeness, but thirst. He hauled water from the slough in a barrel lashed to the wagon, and by the time he reached the field, the barrel was warm, and the water tasted of iron and mud. He poured half of it into the duck pans and the other half on the garden, and Liddy stood at the well until her shoulders ached, pulling up bucket after bucket for the house and the cow. A heat wave killed 7 more ducks on the 3rd day. They died in the shade pen, crowded too close, their small bodies unable to shed the heat fast enough. Ira found them in the morning, stiff, bills open, feathers already dull. Liddy helped him carry them behind the sod house without speaking. She was learning the arithmetic of this too. 181. That night, a fox came. Ira heard the commotion, a sudden eruption of quacking and wing beating that tore through the dark like an alarm. And by the time he reached the pen with the lantern and a shovel, 3 ducks were dead, and the fox was a dark shape vanishing into the slough grass. He reinforced the pen with more willow stakes and sat beside it until dawn, the shovel across his knees, his bad legs stretched straight, because bending it had become something he paid for in hours of swelling. 178, and the lanes were still only 3 of 10, and his knee was a problem he could no longer pretend away. And somewhere west of the prairie line, a freight driver had reported a cloud on the horizon that was not weather. The wheat stood, the ducks ate, the town laughed, and the sky had not yet decided what it was going to do. Marit Hogan appeared on the 4th morning when Ira was failing. He had tried to drive the ducks down the 3rd lane in a group of 25, and the result was chaos. The birds scattered sideways through gaps in the hurdles. 3 squeezed under the willow stakes and vanished into the standing wheat, where Ira could hear them rustling but could not reach them without trampling the crop. The rest bunched at the lane entrance and refused to move, pressing their bodies against each other in a dense, quacking knot that blocked the path entirely. Ira pushed from behind with a board, and the knot tightened. He circled to the front and tried pulling the lead duck by offering grain on a tin plate, and the duck bit his thumb and sat down. Liddy stood at the far end of the lane, holding a water pan and watching with an expression that combined sympathy and the honest assessment of a child who could see the obvious. "They do not want to go that way," Liddy said. "I can see that." "Maybe they want to go the other way." Ira crouched in the dirt, his knees screaming, his thumb bleeding, surrounded by ducks that had decided collectively that the lane was not for them. He had built 3 lanes, spent 4 days cutting willow and hauling water and mixing mash, lost 12 birds to heat and predators, and the system that was supposed to save his wheat could not get 25 ducks to walk in a straight line. That was when the woman came around the corner of the sod house carrying a wooden bucket and a short willow switch. Marit Haugen was 51. She was Norwegian from a farm family near Hallingdal, and she had come to Minnesota with her husband in 1868. The husband had died of pneumonia in 71, leaving her a quarter section north of Ira's claim, a dozen geese, and a knowledge of poultry that went back to her childhood in a country where farms kept birds the way they kept weather. As a fact of existence, not a choice. She was short and broad, with hands that looked like they had been built for the specific purpose of handling livestock. Her hair was gray and pulled back so tight it seemed painted on her skull. She wore a dress the color of old flour sacking and boots that had been resoled so many times the leather above them looked confused about what it was standing on. She did not introduce herself. She walked past Ira, past the bunched ducks, past Liddy with her water pan, and stood at the entrance of the lane. She looked at the hurdles. She looked at the gaps. She looked at the placement of the water pans and the feed trough at the far end. "You're chasing them," Marit said. Her accent was thick, but her English was precise, the words bitten off clean. "Make them chase you." Ira straightened up. "I tried the feed plate." "One plate. Wrong end." Marit set her bucket down. "The feed is at the far end. The water is in the middle. The bird sees the food but wants the water first. It stops. The birds behind it stop. Everything stops." She pulled a tin whistle from her apron pocket. A simple thing, 2 inches long, the kind a child might carry. She blew it once. The sound was high and thin, not loud, but every duck in the lane lifted its head. She blew it again and tapped the wooden bucket with the willow switch. The tap made a hollow, ringing sound. Then she reached into the bucket and scattered a handful of grain mash in a line along the first 10 feet of the lane. The lead duck, the dark cayuga, walked forward, bill down, eating. The duck behind it followed. Within 30 seconds, the knot had untied itself, and the birds were moving in a loose, eager column down the lane, following the trail of mash that Marit laid ahead of them, step by step, whistle and tap. Whistle and tap. "The whistle is the promise," Marit said without turning around. "The pan is the proof. Same sound, same reward every time. The bird does not think, the bird remembers." She reached the end of the lane. The ducks crowded around the feed trough. Marit stepped aside, and the birds that had not eaten from the trail pushed forward and began snapping insects off the wheat stems bordering the lane. The system that Ira had been failing to operate for 4 days was running. Ira stood at the other end, his thumb still bleeding, and felt something he had not felt since the day he bought the birds, the possibility that this was not insane. Marit did not ask permission to return. She came back the next morning before dawn, and the morning after that, and every morning for the next 2 weeks. She brought the whistle, the willow switch, and a knowledge of ducks that made Ira feel like a man who had been trying to read a book in a language he did not speak. She taught 3 skills, and she taught them through doing, not talking. The first was whistle feeding. Same whistle, same pitch, same tin pan tapped with the switch, same reward. A scatter of grain mash or chopped greens, whatever was available. Every morning at the same time. The ducks learned in 4 days. By the 5th morning, Ira could blow the whistle from the sod house door and watch 100 birds lift their heads from the pen and began walking toward the sound. The second was lane pressure. Mart showed Ira how to close the gaps in the hurdles so that the ducks had no option but forward. She used bundles of dried grass lashed to the willow stakes, creating walls that were solid enough to guide but light enough to move when the lane needed to shift. She placed the water pans at intervals, every 30 paces, so that the birds always had a reason to keep moving, and she stationed the feed trough not at the end of the lane but at the turn, so that when the ducks finished one run, they curved into the next and kept going. A duck that stops is a duck that sits, Marit said. A duck that sits will not stand again until it is hungry. Keep them moving. Hunger walks. The third was rotation. Marit had kept geese on her claim for 3 years, and she knew what Ira was learning the hard way. Birds that stayed in one place too long stopped foraging and started damaging what they stood on. 20 ducks in a 12-foot lane would eat the insects in 30 minutes, and then begin trampling the wheat stems for lack of anything else to do. The answer was short passes, 20 minutes per lane, then move the flock to the next. By the time the circuit was complete, insects had recolonized the first lane, and the ducks were hungry again. She also taught Liddy. This was not charity and not sentiment. Marit watched the girl carry water pans for 2 days, and on the third day she handed Liddy the whistle. "You are lighter," Marit told her. "You do not shake the ground when you walk. The birds trust a light step more than a heavy one. Walk ahead. Blow the whistle. Carry the pan. The flock will follow you faster than it follows him." Liddy blew the whistle. The dark Cayuga duck turned its head and walked toward her. Liddy's face did something Ira had not seen since Illinois. It opened. The wariness left, and what replaced it was not happiness exactly, but purpose. She was part of the machine, not a child being protected, a handler. Marit watched Liddy work the flock down a lane, whistle and pan, and nodded once. Then she looked at Ira with an expression that was not warm, but was honest. "The girl is better than you," Marit said. "She does not think about whether it will work. She just does it." Ira did not argue. He was watching his niece walk 200 ducks through a wheat field with a tin whistle and a pie pan, and for the first time in months the weight on his chest was not heavier than the morning before. The days compressed. Work became rhythm, and rhythm became counting. Ira built the remaining lanes, 7 more for a total of 10, each roughly 12 feet wide, cut along the outer margins of the wheat field where the stand was thinnest and the exposure was greatest. He used every piece of willow he could find at the slough. When the willow ran out, he used salvaged crate slats from behind Cowell's freight shed. When those ran out, he lashed bundles of prairie grass to stakes cut from a dead cottonwood that had fallen near the creek. He built shade shelters every 80 paces, frames of scrap wood with canvas stretched between them, angled to block the afternoon sun. The shelters gave the ducks rest points during the hottest hours, and they also concentrated insects beneath them, because grasshoppers sought shade in the same heat that drove the birds to cover. By accident, the rest stops became feeding stations. He moved the ducks in groups of 20. Marit had insisted on this. "Your weak birds cannot keep pace with your strong ones. The weak ones fall behind. They sit. The strong ones trample them. 20 at a time, always 20. The groups developed hierarchies within 3 days. Each squad had a lead duck, usually a cayuga, or a dark-mottled bird with an aggressive temperament, that would enter the lane first, find the first insect, and set the pace. The others followed in a loose column, working the margins. The system looked absurd from the outside. It looked like a man, a child, and an old woman herding disorganized poultry through a wheat field, but from inside the lane, watching the ducks' bills work the stalks and the dirt, hearing the tap, tap, tap of beaks on hard ground, seeing the grasshoppers disappear one by one, the system worked. Not perfectly, not quickly, but it worked. Every evening, Ira counted. He kept a board tally nailed to the inside wall of the sod house, scratched with a nail. After the first week with Marit, 174 ducks alive, 8 lanes operational, 3 acres of wheat edge patrolled daily. After the second week, 171 ducks, all 10 lanes finished. Ducks rotating through the full circuit in a day. Liddy running the whistle for the morning shifts while Ira built and Marit corrected. One group of ducks panicked during a thunderstorm and stampeded through a strip of oats, flattening a swath 10 feet wide. Ira stood in the ruined oats and calculated the loss. Maybe half a bushel. Not enough to break him. Enough to remind him how thin the margins were. His knee swelled until the joint locked, and he could not bend it at all. He cut his trouser seam open with a knife so the fabric would not press against the swelling. Marit found him standing in a lane at midday, his weight on one leg like a heron, trying to move hurdles with his arms because his legs would not cooperate. She did not ask if he was hurt. She said, "Sit." He sat. Liddy drove the pan. The flock moved. The system did not require Ira's legs. It required his judgment and Liddy's whistle and Marit's knowledge, and the ducks did the rest. On the 9th day of Marit's visits, Nora Dinsmore's older son, Caleb, appeared at the fence with a grain sack over his shoulder. Inside was cracked barley, not much, maybe 10 pounds, that Nora had been saving for her chickens. "Ma says this is not belief," Caleb said. "She says it is curiosity." Ira took the barley. It went into the mash that night, and the ducks that ate it moved faster the next morning, their feathers glossier, their bills sharper against the ground. 10 pounds of barley from a skeptic who would not call it help. Pike returned on the second Saturday. He walked the field edge again, and this time he watched the ducks work a lane for 15 minutes without speaking. Marit was at the far end, whistle between her teeth, willow switch tapping the bucket. Liddy was in the middle, carrying water pans ahead of the flock. The ducks moved in their column, bills working, the ground behind them visibly cleaner than the ground ahead. Pike watched. Then he shook his head. "Birds eat bugs," Pike said. "I do not deny it, but I have seen what is coming, Bellamy. I have seen hoppers pile so deep they stopped a locomotive. I have seen them eat harness leather and the curtains off a window. You are training ducks to eat puddles, and the ocean is on its way." "I am not training them to stop the ocean," Ira said. "I am training them to eat the edges." "Edges will not save 12 acres. Edges will save the first row. The first row will save the shocks. The shocks will save the seed." Pike looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I hope you are right, because if you are wrong, that girl is going to eat duck and nothing else until the snow melts." He left. Marit watched him go and said nothing. She blew the whistle. The ducks turned. The sky changed on the last day of July. Not the color. The color was the same hard white that had sat over the prairie for weeks, bleaching the grass and baking the dirt until it cracked in patterns that looked like broken pottery. What changed was the feel of the air, a thickness that was not humidity and not heat, but something else, a pressure that sat behind the eyes and made the horses in town stamp and pull at their ropes. Locusts appeared in places they should not have been. A woman found 3 in her flour barrel. A child pulled one from inside a boot. They clung to fence posts and well ropes and the undersides of wagon seats, and when they were brushed off, they flew in short, erratic bursts and landed somewhere else. These were not the swarm. These were the outriders, the first wave, the leading edge of something that had not yet arrived. Ira checked his board tally. 190 ducks alive. 9 had recovered enough to rejoin the flock, offsetting the deaths. 12 acres of wheat standing, heads nearly full, close to cutting, but not ready. 4 acres of oats damaged at the edge by the stampede, but still worth saving. Kitchen garden intact. Less than 1 sack of feed remaining for the ducks. 4 days until the wheat would be ready to cut. Maybe 5. Pike went door to door telling families to prepare. Tar pans, smoke fires, wet blankets, scythes. Every man who could hold a blade should be in the field at dawn, cutting early and stacking fast, saving what could be saved before the cloud arrived. Thorne began offering cash for claims. $5 for a quarter section, $7 for one with improvements. He moved through the settlement like a man shopping for coats at a funeral, his ledger book under his arm, his voice low and reasonable. If the crop goes, you will wish you had taken the offer, he told families at the store. I'm giving you a choice before the hoppers take it away. Ira did not cut early. He watched the wheat heads, felt the kernels between his fingers the way Pike had done weeks before, and waited. The grain was close, starchy, but not full. Cutting now would save the stalks but lose a quarter of the yield, the difference between 13 bushels and 9. 9 was not enough. 9 was sell the cow and pray. He needed 4 more days. And the sky was pressing down, and the outriders were landing on his fence posts, and the ducks were restless in their pens at night, their heads turning west toward something they could feel but he could not see. Marit came to the lane at dawn on the first day of August. She looked at the sky the way a woman who had grown up reading weather looked at the sky, not with her eyes but with her whole body, her shoulders set, her chin lifted, her hands still at her sides. 2 days, she said. Maybe 3. How do you know? The geese knew before I did. They will not leave the pen. She looked at Ira. Your birds will know too. When the ducks go silent, it is coming. The swarm arrived on the 3rd day of August, 1874, and it came as sound before shape. The first thing Ira heard was not buzzing. It was a dry, papery roar, the sound of a million wings beating against each other, a sound like sleet hitting a roof made of leaves. It came from the west, and it filled the sky from horizon to horizon, not gradually but all at once, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. The light changed. Not dark, not twilight, but a dirty amber that made the wheat look brown and the dirt look gray and the world look like something seen through smoked glass. Liddy was in the garden when the light changed. She looked up and screamed, not a word, just a sound, raw and involuntary, because the western wall of the sod house appeared to move. It was not the wall, it was insects, thousands of them landing on the sod surface, their bodies so close together they made the wall seem alive, a rippling skin of legs and wings and mandibles. Ira was in the first lane with the lead group of ducks when the swarm hit. The locusts came down like hail, not landing gently but falling, dropping from the cloud above with a dry, pattering sound that covered his shoulders, his hat, his arms. They hit the wheat, and the stalks bent under the weight. They hit the ground and piled. Within 3 minutes, the lane floor was carpeted with insects so thick that Ira's boots crunched with every step. The ducks panicked. The first group, 20 birds, the strongest of the flock, broke formation and scattered. Some ran toward the sod house, some flattened themselves against the hurdles. 2 flew, a short, desperate burst that carried them over the wheat and out of sight. The rest pressed together in a knot at the lane entrance, the same bunching behavior that Ira had seen the first day, but worse now because the insects were crawling on them, climbing their feathers, and the birds could not tell what was food and what was threat. The system was failing in the first 60 seconds. Marit threw herself in front of the lead pen gate. She was 51 years old, and she weighed perhaps 120 pounds, and the gate was held shut with a loop of twine, and she pressed her body against it and blew the whistle. One long, high note that cut through the roar of the swarm like a needle through cloth. The panicked ducks in the lane stopped scattering. The Cayuga lead bird turned its head. Marit blew the whistle again and tapped the bucket. Liddy appeared from the garden at a dead run, a feed pan in each hand, insects in her hair and on her dress and crawling up her arms. She did not stop to brush them off. She reached the lane entrance and banged the pan against a hurdle post. Clang, 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 and threw a handful of grain mash into the first 10 feet of the lane. The Cayuga walked forward. Its bill struck the ground. But it did not hit grain. It hit a grasshopper, then another, then another. The bird's head moved so fast it blurred. Strike, swallow, strike, swallow, strike, and the mechanical feeding instinct that Marit had spent 2 weeks training took over. The duck was not panicking anymore. It was eating. The ground was covered with food, and the bird remembered what food meant. Whistle, pan, eat. The second duck followed. The third. The knot loosened. Within 2 minutes, the 20 ducks were working the lane, their bills hammering the ground, the carpet of insects thinning behind them as they moved. Ira released the second group. 40 ducks in the outer lanes. Marit kept the whistle going, a steady rhythm, blow, tap, that gave the birds a pattern to follow. Liddy ran water pans ahead of the flock, her small boots crushing locusts with every step, her arms shaking from the weight of the tin. Nora Dinsmore appeared at the fence. She had not been asked. She climbed over and ran to the nearest lane with a piece of wet burlap, and she began doing what Ira had designed but never tested at scale. She dragged the burlap through the standing wheat on either side of the lane, shaking the stalks, and the locusts fell. Hundreds of them, shaken loose, tumbling into the lane where the ducks were waiting. The ducks surged forward. The sound of 200 bills hitting the ground was audible over the roar of the swarm. "More!" Ira shouted. "The outer lanes! Shake them into the lanes!" Nora's sons arrived, Caleb with a rake, Owen with a broom handle. They worked the wheat from the outside, beating the stalks, and the insects cascaded into the feeding corridors like grain from a shaken sieve. The ducks did not look up. They did not stop. They ate, but the swarm did not stop either. Locusts continued to fall from the sky in sheets. For every 100 the ducks consumed, 1,000 more landed. The wheat bent further. Ira could hear the stalks cracking, a sound like small bones breaking, the sound of grain heads snapping under the accumulated weight of insects that had been flying since morning and now wanted to feed. He released the third group, 60 ducks in the lanes, then the fourth, 80. The birds were spreading through the system now, following the lanes that Marit had taught them, guided by whistle and pan and the overwhelming presence of food on every surface. Some ducks had stopped walking and were simply standing in place, their bills working the ground around their feet, gorging until their crops bulged and their movements slowed. "Rotate them," Marit shouted from the far lane. "Pull the full ones. Send the hungry ones." Ira tried. He opened the pen gate and released the fifth group, the weakest birds, the ones that had only recently recovered enough to walk. They stumbled into the lanes and began eating with a desperation that the stronger birds had lost. "Hunger," Marit had said. "Hunger walks." The starving ducks worked faster than the fed ones, their bills a blur. their small bodies vibrating with the effort of consuming as much as possible before the chance disappeared. Then the smoke came. Pike's men had built smudge fires along the road, tar pans, green wood, wet blankets thrown over coals to create thick black smoke that was supposed to drive the locusts away from the settlement. The fires worked after a fashion. The smoke did push the insects sideways. But the wind shifted at midday, and the smoke did not drift north toward the empty prairie. It drifted east into Ira's field. The smoke hit the third lane like a wall. The ducks in the lane went blind. They scattered, crashing into hurdles, trampling each other, quacking in a register that Ira had not heard before, not complaint, but terror. Marit's whistle was useless against smoke the birds could not see through. 2 ducks broke through a hurdle gap and disappeared into the wheat. 3 more piled against the end post and would not move. Ira had 10 seconds to decide. He could leave the outer lanes, abandon the wheat edge that the ducks had been protecting all morning, and try to recover the blinded birds in the smoke. Or he could open the inner pen, release the last 40 ducks, and hope they moved toward the clear lanes instead of into the smoke. He opened the inner pen. Stay with this story, because in the next few minutes Ira learns whether he trained a flock or released the last thing that could destroy what the locusts had not reached. 40 ducks poured through the gate. The first 10 found a lane and entered it, bills already working. The next 15 split, half toward the clear lanes, half toward the smoke, drawn by the quacking of the panicked birds they could hear but not see. The last 15 scattered into the open. Liddy dropped her water pan and ran. She did not run away from the ducks. She ran ahead of them, into the wheat, and she blew the whistle, the same note, the same rhythm, the steady promise that Marit had built into the flock's memory over 14 days of training. The ducks that had scattered toward the open stopped. The cayuga lead bird appeared from a lane, its bill dripping with insect matter, and turned toward the whistle. It followed Liddy. The others followed the cayuga. Within 5 minutes, Liddy had pulled 20 of the scattered ducks into a clear lane on the south side, away from the smoke. She was 9 years old. She was covered in locusts. Her hair was matted with crushed insect bodies, and her arms were scratched from wheat stalks, and her boots were so caked with grasshopper remains that each step made a sound like wet clay. She did not stop. Marit handled the smoke. She tied the wet burlap over her face and waded into the third lane, grabbing ducks by the body and carrying them 2 at a time to the clear lanes. The birds she recovered were disoriented but uninjured. She lost 4 to trampling. She saved 11. Ira worked the outer lanes alone. His knee had stopped being a problem because it had stopped being a knee. It was a column of heat and swelling that he dragged behind him like a broken tool, and every step sent a bolt of white pain up his thigh and into his hip. He ignored it the way he had learned to ignore pain in the army, not by being brave, but by being busy. There was too much to do for pain to matter. He shook wheat. He dragged burlap. He kicked locusts into the lanes where the ducks were waiting. He repositioned hurdles that the wind had knocked over. He moved shade shelters to cover birds that had stopped eating because the sun had returned through a gap in the swarm, and the temperature on the ground was climbing past 100 degrees. The contrast with his neighbors became visible by mid-afternoon. Nora's oat patch, the 4 acres that shared a boundary with Ira's land, had no lanes, no ducks, no burlap funnels. The locusts landed and ate. By noon, the oat heads were gone. By 2 o'clock, the stalks were stripped to fiber. By 4, the patch looked like it had been mowed by something that hated plants. Nora stood at the fence and watched her oats disappear, and she did not cry because she had already done that earlier in the year and had decided it did not help. Pike's tar pans caught thousands of locusts. Thousands. The pans were black with bodies, and the smoke from the burning insects added a sweet, greasy smell to the air that made children vomit. But thousands was nothing against millions. Pike's wheat field, 6 acres of good stand planted early and tended carefully, was eaten to stubble by sunset. He stood in the ruined field and said nothing, and the men who had followed his advice about scythes and tar pans said nothing either, because there was nothing to say. Thorne's store garden, a small plot behind the building where he grew onions and carrots for his own table, was stripped to bare dirt. The locusts ate the vegetable leaves, then the stems, then the roots, where they pushed through the soil surface. They ate the burlap Thorne had thrown over the bed. He would later claim they ate the paper label off a molasses tin, though no one could confirm this. A farmer 3 claims east of Ira tried to save a shock pile by standing over it with a blanket, waving his arms for hours. The heat and the smoke from Pike's fires caught him at 4 in the afternoon. He dropped in the field, and it was Ira who found him. Not because Ira was looking, but because the man had fallen beside the duck lane that bordered his claim, and Ira was walking that lane to move a hurdle. Ira dragged the man into the shade shelter, poured water on his head from a duck pan, and sent Caleb Dinsmore to fetch help. The man lived. He never thanked Ira. He was too ashamed to have collapsed in a duck lane. By evening, the swarm had thinned but not departed. Locusts still clung to every surface: fence posts, sod walls, the inside of the well cover, the underside of the wagon. The sky was visible again, a bruised orange that meant the sun was setting behind a cloud of insects that stretched west for miles. Ira walked the lanes by lantern light. The ducks were done. Most had stopped eating hours ago, their crops distended, their bodies heavy and slow. They sat in the lanes and the shade shelters, and some of them were already asleep, their bills tucked under their wings, their bodies surrounded by a carpet of dead and dying insects that they had eaten through like a path cut in snow. The wheat was not saved, not all of it. The outer rows on the north and west, the edges farthest from the lanes, were stripped. The oat patch was gone. The kitchen garden was damaged, beans chewed to stems, squash leaves eaten to lace. But the lanes were standing. The wheat inside the lane margins, the rows closest to where the ducks had worked, still had heads. Bent, damaged, some with locusts still clinging to them, but heads with grain inside. The shock piles that Ira had stacked during the lane cutting were intact, covered with burlap that the ducks had patrolled all day. The inner field, the 6 acres closest to the sod house, where Liddy and Marit had run the rotation, was damaged but alive. Ira sat down in the dirt at the end of the first lane. His knee would not bend. His hands were raw. His shirt was stiff with dried insect bodies and sweat. Liddy sat beside him, and she leaned against his arm, and neither of them spoke, because the sound of locusts chewing in the dark was still audible, and the night was not over, and the birds could not eat forever. But the wheat stood. Not all of it. Enough of it. The sky had tried to take everything, and the ducks had argued with the sky, and the argument was not finished, but the wheat stood. The morning after the swarm, the settlement woke into a world that looked scraped. Ira stood at the boundary between his claim and Nora's before the sun cleared the eastern grass line. The difference was visible from 100 paces. On Nora's side, the oat field was gone, not thinned, not damaged, gone. The stalks stood like pale sticks pushed into dirt, stripped of every leaf and head and fiber that a locust could chew. The ground between them was littered with insect carcasses and droppings, a brown crust that crumbled underfoot. On Ira's side, the outer wheat rows showed the same damage. Bare stalks, eaten heads, the ruin that the swarm had reached before the ducks could work. But inside the lane margins, the wheat stood, bent, bruised, heads hanging lower than they should have, but standing with grain inside, and that was the difference between winter and no winter. Ira did not celebrate. He counted. He walked every lane, checked every shock pile, pulled wheat heads, and rolled kernels between his fingers the way Pike had taught him without meaning to. The inner 6 acres were salvageable. The outer edges, maybe 2 acres total, were lost. The oats were gone entirely. The kitchen garden was half destroyed, beans stripped, squash damaged, but the root vegetables underground had survived because the locusts could not reach them. He pulled a board from the shock pile and scratched the numbers with a nail. Estimated yield from what remained, 13 bushels of wheat if he cut today and nothing else went wrong. No oats, garden beans gone, but potatoes and turnips still in the ground. Duck flock, 167 alive, after the losses from smoke and trampling and heat. 13 bushels. It was not comfort. It was arithmetic that pointed toward survival instead of away from it. Whitcomb Pike came at mid-morning. He did not announce himself. He walked from the road along the fence line, following the boundary between Ira's claim and the stripped field to the north, and he stopped where the first duck lane met the standing wheat. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his coat pockets, his hat pushed back on his head, looking at the wheat the way a man looks at something he had been certain would not exist. Ira was in the lane, pulling a damaged hurdle upright. He saw Pike and straightened but did not walk toward him. He waited. Pike entered the lane. He walked its full length, 80 paces, stepping over duck droppings and insect carcasses and the flattened grass where the burlap funnels had been dragged. At the end of the lane, he crouched and pulled a wheat head. He rolled the kernels. He held them to his nose. He put one in his mouth and bit down, testing the starch. Then he stood and walked back to where Ira was standing. "How many bushels?" Pike asked. 13, if I cut today." "Your oats?" "Gone." "Garden?" "Half." Pike nodded. He looked at the ducks, which were resting in the shade shelters, their bodies heavy and slow from the previous day's gorging. Several were already moving, though, the younger, hungrier birds, picking at the insect carcasses that still littered the lane floor. "I told you the ocean was coming," Pike said. "I was right about the ocean. I was wrong about the birds." Ira said nothing. "I was wrong about the birds," Pike said again, as if he needed to hear the sentence twice to believe he was saying it. "I was not wrong about the odds. You did not stop the swarm. Nobody stopped the swarm, but you changed the field. You made the edges into something the swarm could not take as fast as it took everything else." He extended his hand. Ira shook it. Pike's grip was the same oak-hard pressure it had always been, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Not warmth, not admiration, but the recalibration of a man who had measured the world one way for 58 years and was being forced to add a new number. "I want to see the lane system," Pike said. "I want to understand how the hurdles channel the insects." "I will show you," Ira said, "but I am cutting wheat first." "Then I will help you cut." Pike went to his claim and returned with a cradle scythe and his hired man, a silent Swede named Peter, who could cut an acre in a day and did not require conversation. They worked Ira's field for 3 hours. Pike and Peter cutting, Ira binding sheaves with his bad knee locked straight, Liddy stacking. By noon, the salvageable wheat was cut and shocked and covered with every piece of burlap Ira owned. It was the first time since his arrival that anyone had worked Ira's land beside him without being asked, without owing him, without expecting payment. Nora came that afternoon. She did not come to congratulate. She came to learn. She walked the lanes with her arms crossed and her mouth set in the thin line of a woman who was doing arithmetic she did not like. "My oats are gone," she said. "My wheat is gone. I have potatoes in the ground and chickens that are alive because they hid under the henhouse floor. I have 2 boys and no husband, and winter is coming." "I know," Ira said. "I need to understand this." She pointed at the lanes, the hurdles, the shade shelters, the water pans. "Not because I think it will save me now. Because if the hoppers come back next year, and they will come back next year, I need something besides a blanket and a prayer." Ira walked her through the system, not lecturing, showing. He took her into a lane where a group of 20 ducks was already working the post-swarm cleanup, eating dead and dying locusts off the wheat stubble. He showed her how the hurdles created a channel, how the water pans kept the birds moving forward, how the burlap funnels shook insects from standing stalks into the feeding path. Nora watched the ducks work. She watched Liddy blow the whistle and tap the pan and lead a group from one lane to the next. She watched Marit adjust a hurdle angle so that the ducks would curve at the turn instead of bunching. "How many ducks would I need?" Nora asked. "For your acreage, 60 would patrol the edges. 100 would be better." "Where do I get 60 ducks when every bird in the county is worth its weight in flour?" "You start with eggs. My drakes and your hen's eggs will not cross, but my ducks are laying again. I can give you 2 dozen eggs this week. The rest you buy, beg, or trade for." "I have nothing to trade." "You have labor," Ira said. "Your boys worked my lanes during the swarm. That was worth more than money." Nora looked at him. Something complicated moved across her face. Gratitude and resentment, and the particular stubbornness of a person who does not want to need help, but is smart enough to take it. "I will build lanes this week," she said. "Show Caleb the hurdle pattern." She left. But she came back the next morning with Caleb and Owen, and Ira showed them how to cut willow and lash it and set the stakes so the gaps were too narrow for ducks to squeeze through. The boys worked fast. They did not ask why. They had watched their mother's oats disappear, and that was reason enough. Other families came, not all at once, and not with enthusiasm, but with the particular gravity of people who had lost something and needed to understand why their neighbor had not. A German farmer named Albrecht Wendt brought his wife and 3 children and stood at the edge of the lane system for 20 minutes before he spoke. His wheat was gone, his corn was eaten to the stalk. He had $7 and a wagon and the clothes his family wore. "I do not want charity," Wendt said. "I want to know what you did," Ira told him. Not the full system. Wendt could not build lanes without ducks, and he did not have ducks, but the principle, concentration, edges, funneling insects into kill zones instead of trying to protect every square foot. Wendt listened with the focus of a man memorizing something he would need to repeat. A widow named Clara Foss came with a dozen questions about the burlap funnels. She did not have ducks either, but she had chickens, and she wanted to know if chickens could work the lanes the same way. Ira told her chickens scratched more than they pecked, which meant they would damage the grain stubble, but they could work a garden plot if the lanes were narrower and the rotation shorter. Clara went home and built 4 garden lanes out of scrap lumber, and her chickens cleared the post-swarm insects from her root vegetables in 2 days. Ira did not charge for the information. He did not hold it back. Every family that asked received the same answer: the method, the materials, the timing, the limits, what the ducks could do, what they could not, how many birds per acre, how much water, how often to rotate. Marit watched the teaching with an expression Ira could not read. On the 3rd day after the swarm, when Ira had explained the lane system to 4 families in a single afternoon, she found him alone at the well, and said something that would stay with him longer than anything Pike or Thorn had ever spoken. "The system is no longer yours," Marit said. "If you keep it, it dies with your field. If you teach it, it walks." Thorn's reaction to Ira's survival was not conversion, it was calculation. The storekeeper had lost his garden and his patience, but not his ledger. Within a week of the swarm, he had acquired 3 abandoned claims at $5 each from families who could not face another season. He had raised the price of flour to twice what it had been in June. He had raised the price of salt pork, lamp oil, and nails by margins that made families count their coins twice before entering the store. And he had begun telling anyone who would listen that Ira Bellamy's ducks had drawn the locusts toward his land. "Those birds attracted the swarm," Thorne said at the store counter, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who understood that repetition created truth. "Bellamy's field had more insects than anyone else's. The ducks brought them. The rest of us paid the price." The accusation was absurd on its face. A swarm that darkened the sky for miles was not drawn by 200 ducks, but fear did not require logic. Fear required someone to blame, and Thorne was offering a target. 2 families who had lost everything repeated the claim at the well. A man Ira did not recognize shouted it at him from a passing wagon. Ira did not argue. He had learned in the army that arguing with fear was like arguing with weather. You could not reason a man out of a position he had not reasoned himself into. You could only wait and work and let the evidence accumulate until the weight of it collapsed the accusation on its own. But the accusation stung. It stung because it came from the same place as the dead crow on the fence and the children quacking in the road. The settlements need to punish anyone who had survived better than expected. Success was tolerable if everyone shared it. Success by one man, using a method everyone had mocked, was an indictment of every person who had not tried it. Marit heard the accusation and laughed, a short, hard sound with no warmth in it. "Thorne says your ducks called the locusts. I suppose my geese called the winter, too. Tell Thorne his prices called the hunger, and see how he likes the logic." The mentor relationship reached its deepest point in the second week after the swarm, during the days when the cleanup work was heaviest, and the emotional weight of what had happened was settling into the bones of everyone who had lived through it. Marit came every morning. She and Ira worked the lanes together, repairing hurdles, moving shade shelters, adjusting the rotation schedule as the post-swarm insect population shifted from living adults to dying stragglers, to eggs laid in the warm soil. The work was quieter now, less urgent, but it required the same attention because the ducks that had saved the wheat were also the ducks that needed to be kept alive through a stretch when feed was scarce and the flock was exhausted. They talked while they worked. Not about the system, by now the system was in their hands, automatic, but about the things that work made room for. Marit told Ira about Hallingdal, about the farm where she had grown up, about geese that her grandmother kept in a stone pen by the river, and how the old woman could tell the weather by watching which direction the geese faced at dawn. She told him about her husband, a quiet man named Torsten who had been good with wood and bad with money, and who had died coughing in a sod house not much better than Ira's. Ira told Marit about Vicksburg, not the battle, the waiting. The weeks after the siege, when the camp sprawled along the bluffs, and the supply situation rotted, and the hospital tents filled with men who were dying of things that had nothing to do with bullets. He told her about the Indiana man with the ducks, and about the sound the birds made when they worked, that mechanical tap, tap, tap that meant hunger was being converted into something useful. "That is what you heard when you bought the crate," Marit said. It was not a question. "I heard it in the smell," Ira said. "Sour grain and damp feathers. The station platform smelled like the commissary tent." Marit nodded. She understood the way memory worked in the body, how a smell or a sound could carry a lesson across years and deposit it exactly where it was needed. On the 12th day after the swarm, they disagreed. Ira wanted to expand the lanes into the inner field, cutting more paths through the standing wheat to give the ducks access to the deeper rows where eggs might be hatching. Merritt said no. The inner wheat was the grain he needed most. Cutting lanes through it would reduce his yield by 2 or 3 bushels. Bushels he could not afford to lose. You are protecting the wheat by destroying the wheat, Marit said. The ducks can reach the eggs from the edges. You do not need to open the center. If the eggs hatch inside the stand, the nymphs will eat from the inside out. The ducks will never reach them. Then you dig trenches at the margin. You do not cut grain you need to eat. They stood in the field and argued, not loudly, not with anger, but with the intensity of 2 people who respected each other enough to disagree without retreating. Ira wanted aggressive prevention. Marit wanted conservative preservation. The disagreement was real, and it had no easy resolution because both of them were right about different parts of the problem. In the end, Ira compromised. He cut 2 narrow lanes into the inner field, not 12 feet wide but 6 in, and left the rest standing. It cost him perhaps 1.5 bushels. But it gave the ducks access to the interior, and when the nymphs hatched 3 weeks later, those narrow lanes became the first line of defense. Marit weakened in the 3rd week of August. The signs were not dramatic. She arrived later in the mornings. She rested more often, sitting on an overturned bucket beside the lane entrance while Liddy ran the whistle. Her cough, a dry, persistent sound that Ira had noticed since the smoke incident during the swarm, grew deeper and more frequent. She waved it away when Ira asked, the way old people wave away questions about their health, as if acknowledging a problem would give it permission to worsen. She kept teaching. She showed Nora's sons how to build a portable shade sled, a frame on runners that could be dragged from lane to lane without lifting, and how to angle it so the shadow fell across the feeding path. She showed Clara Foss the chicken lane modifications. She corrected every mistake with the same blunt precision she had used the first day she appeared at Ira's fence. But she was slower, and on the morning when she sat down on the bucket and could not stand up again without Ira's hand, they both knew what neither of them said. My cow is sick, Marit told Ira. It was the excuse, not the reason. I have been away too long. The claim needs work. I will send Caleb to check on your cow. You will not. You will keep building lanes, and you will teach the Went family, and you will not waste a boy's legs on an old woman's milk cow. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the tin whistle, the same one she had used the first morning, the one that had untied the knot of panicked ducks in the lane entrance. She held it out to Ira. Liddy does not need it, Marit said. The girl whistles better than the tin, but you might. Ira took the whistle. It was warm from her pocket and lighter than he expected, and it felt like being handed something that weighed more than metal. Marit walked back toward her claim. She did not look back. Her silhouette against the morning grass grew smaller, and the cough followed her like a second shadow, and Ira stood in the lane with the whistle in his hand and the ducks at his feet, in a silence that had nothing to do with sound. There is a kind of loss that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with ceremony or collapse. It arrives as an empty space at the end of a lane where someone used to stand, as a whistle that sounds different when a different hand holds it, as a morning that begins the same way but feels lighter in all the wrong places. Marit Haugen did not die that week. She returned to her claim and tended her sick cow and sat in her own sod house and coughed. But she did not come back to Ira's field, and her absence was a weight that settled into the work the way cold settled into the ground, gradually, completely, without asking permission. The secondary crisis arrived in the first week of September, and it walked instead of flying. Locust eggs, laid in the warm soil during the swarm, hatched along the slough bank and the low ground east of Ira's claim. The nymphs emerged as pale, wingless creatures smaller than a man's fingernail. Thousands of them, then tens of thousands, crawling out of the dirt in a slow, spreading carpet that moved across the grass with a purpose that flying swarms lacked. A flying swarm was chaos, millions of insects landing wherever the wind dropped them. A nymph hatch was an army. It marched in one direction, eating everything in its path, and it did not stop until it ran out of food or grew wings and lifted. The hatch headed east toward the wheat stubble and the garden plots, and the grain that families were trying to dry and store. Ira saw the nymphs on a Tuesday morning. He was walking the slough bank looking for willow to repair a hurdle, and the ground moved under his boot. Not one insect. A sheet of them flowing over the soil like water, their tiny bodies climbing over each other in a tide that was 2 inches deep in the low spots and spreading. He had no marret. He had no time to wait for help. He had the lanes, the ducks, and the narrow trenches that his compromise with Marit had put into the inner field. He dug. Using a spade and a hoe and Nora's boys and every hour of daylight, he cut shallow trenches, 8 inches deep, 6 inches wide, across the nymph's path between the slough and his field edge. The trenches were not deep enough to trap every insect, but they slowed the march. Nymphs that fell in could not climb the vertical dirt walls. They piled at the bottom, crawling over each other, and the pile grew until it became a feeding trough. Ira released the ducks along the trench line. The birds had never seen nymphs before, but nymphs were insects, and insects were food, and the ducks' bills hit the trench bottoms with the same mechanical focus they had brought to the swarm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound ran along the trench like a drum roll. 20 ducks worked a 10-foot section of trench clean in 15 minutes. Ira moved them to the next section. Liddy ran the whistle. The nymph hatch lasted 4 days. Each morning, new insects emerged from the egg beds. Each morning, Ira extended the trenches, moved the duck rotations, and sent Caleb to check the eastern boundary where the nymphs were thickest. The ducks ate until their crops bulged, rested, and ate again. The trench system was not elegant. It was crude and exhausting, and it required Ira to be in the field from before dawn until after dark, dragging his locked knee through dirt and insect mash and mud. But it worked. Not by stopping the hatch. He could not stop biology any more than he could stop the sky, but by interrupting it. The nymphs that reached the trenches died. The nymphs that bypassed the trenches hit the lane system and died there. The nymphs that made it past both defenses reached wheat stubble that had already been cut and found nothing to eat. By the 5th day, the hatch slowed. By the 7th, it stopped. The egg beds near the slough were exhausted, and the ground that Ira's trenches had protected was clear. He stood at the trench line on the 7th morning and realized something had changed, not in the field, in him. During the swarm, he had been reacting, scrambling, improvising, surviving. During the nymph hatch, he had been planning, anticipating, deploying the ducks not as a desperate defense, but as a tool, placed where it would do the most damage to the enemy's advance. He was not fighting the locusts. He was managing them. He was reading their movement the way Pike read wheat heads and Merritt read weather, and he was putting his birds in the path before the path reached his grain. Marit's lesson applied without Marit. The whistle in his pocket felt heavier than before. If this story reminds you why preparation matters before the crisis arrives, share it with someone who understands that survival is usually built before anyone believes it is needed. The weeks after the nymph hatch changed the social geography of the settlement. Families that had dismissed Ira now came to his fence with questions. Families that had laughed at the ducks now asked where to buy eggs. The man whose shock pile Ira had failed to save during the swarm came back, not to thank him, but to ask how the trench system worked. He stood at the trench line and studied the dirt walls and the duck droppings and the carcasses of 10,000 nymphs, and he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is revising a story he has been telling himself. Thorn's accusation that the ducks had drawn the swarm died the way bad logic dies, not through refutation, but through irrelevance. The families who had repeated it were now the families building lanes and asking about duck eggs. They could not simultaneously blame Ira for the swarm and copy his method for surviving it. The contradiction was too heavy to carry, and they set it down quietly, without apology, the way people set down things they are ashamed to have picked up. Thorn himself did not come to the fence. He watched from the store, his ledger open, his prices still high, his 3 acquired claims still empty. He had grain in his shed, sacks he had bought before the swarm at low prices, and was now selling at high ones. And for the moment, that grain was power. Families that could not feed themselves through the winter would come to Thorn, and Thorn would sell at whatever price the hunger demanded. But the hunger was shifting. Ira's ducks were laying again. The flock had recovered faster than anyone expected, and the post-swarm diet of insects had made the eggs rich and large. Nora's chickens, working Clara Foss's modified garden lanes, had cleared enough ground for a late planting of turnips. The families that had copied the trench system had saved root vegetables and dried beans that would have been eaten by the nymph march. Thorn's monopoly on survival depended on everyone else having nothing, and Ira's teaching was giving them something. Not much, not enough, but enough to bargain, enough to choose, enough to walk past the store counter without the particular desperation that Thorn's prices required. The storekeeper sat behind his counter and felt the ledger shift beneath his fingers, and for the first time since the swarm, the man who had called Ira's ducks feathers when he needed flour understood that feathers were becoming flour, and there was nothing in his ledger that could stop it. By the middle of September, Ira Bellamy's claim had become a place people walked to. Not for help. The settlement had too much pride for that, even after the swarm had stripped it bare. They walked to Ira's fence to see the ducks work. They came in the early morning when the light was flat and gold across the stubble, and they stood at the lane entrance and watched 160 birds move through the field in their rotation. Whistle, pan, tap. 20 birds forward, 20 birds resting, the flock cycling through the lanes like water through a mill wheel. The birds were healthy now. Their feathers had filled in, the cayugas showing that deep green-black sheen that caught the light like oil on water, the mottled birds plump and aggressive, the pale drakes strutting at the edges of the group with the self-importance of animals that had discovered their purpose. People came to see the ducks. They stayed to learn the system. Ira improved it every week. The improvements were not inventions. They were refinements, each one born from a failure or a near miss that taught him something the original design had missed. He broke the flock into smaller groups. 20 had been Marit's number, and it worked, but 10 was better for the garden plots and the narrow trench lines. 10 ducks moved faster, turned sharper, and did not pile up at corners the way 20 did. He kept the groups of 20 for the field lanes, where the wider paths gave room for the birds to spread. He built movable shade sleds, the design Merritt had shown Nora's boys, and added runners made from split saplings so they could be dragged by one person. Liddy could pull a shade sled 30 paces in under a minute, repositioning shade as the sun moved. The ducks learned to follow the shade the way they had learned to follow the whistle, because shade meant rest, and rest meant the next feeding cycle was coming. He added brush wings to the lane entrances. These were willow frames covered with dried grass, angled inward, that funneled airborne insects into the lane when the wind blew across the field. A grasshopper carried on a gust would hit the brush wing, tumble into the feeding path, and land among ducks that did not care how it had arrived. The brush wings also blocked the wind from scattering the lighter nymphs away from the feeding zone. He set night pens around the shock piles. After the swarm, he had noticed that insects drawn to stored grain were heaviest at dusk and dawn. They climbed the shocks during the warm hours and fed on the exposed heads. 15 ducks penned overnight beside a shock pile would patrol the base in the early morning, catching insects as they descended. The shock piles that had duck pens lost less grain than those that did not. Ira measured the difference by weighing threshed bushels and found a gap of nearly half a bushel per shock over 2 weeks. He organized children. Nora's boys were the first, but by the end of September, 3 other families had sent children to learn the whistle system. Ira taught them the way Marit had taught Liddy, by handing them the pan and stepping back. The children learned faster than the adults. They did not question the method or debate the logic. They blew the whistle, tapped the pan, and walked. The ducks followed. He built hopper barrels. These were old flour barrels set into shallow pits along the lane edges, with brush ramps leading to the rim. Insects climbing the ramps fell into the barrels and could not escape. Every evening, Ira and Liddy emptied the barrels into the duck pens, a concentrated feed that supplemented the mash and kept the flock strong without consuming the grain stores. The locusts that had come to eat the wheat were becoming the food that sustained the birds that protected the wheat. The circle was not elegant, but it was closed. Albrecht Wendt built his first lane in the last week of September. He did not have ducks. The eggs Ira had given him would not hatch until spring, but he had adapted the trench system for chickens and was using it to protect his late-planted turnips. His wife, a small woman named Frida, who spoke more than Albrecht and feared less, told Ira that the turnips were the first food her children had seen growing since the swarm. She did not say thank you. She said, "The children need to see something alive in the ground." Clara Foss expanded her chicken lanes to cover a neighbor's garden plot. She modified the hurdle design to use straight sticks instead of willow. Willow was scarce now, stripped by every family building lanes, and she lashed them with rawhide instead of twine. The modification was better than Ira's original. Rawhide shrank when it dried, tightening the joints. Ira adopted it. By the 1st of October, 4 farms had functioning lane systems. 2 used ducks, 2 used chickens, all used the trench lines and the brush funnels and the shade shelters that Ira had designed and Marit had refined. Not all of them worked perfectly. Wendt lost a section of turnips when his chickens scratched too deep and pulled up seedlings. Clara's neighbor overfed her birds, and the chickens stopped foraging, but the failures were local and temporary, and the fixes were simple, and each fix made the system stronger. The method spread by demonstration. There was no pamphlet, no written instructions. Ira showed people, and they showed other people, and the knowledge moved through the settlement the way water moved through grass, slowly, unevenly, following the paths of least resistance, pooling where it found willing ground. Thorne's reckoning came not as a confrontation, but as an erosion. His grain shed stood behind the store, a timber frame structure with plank walls and a shingled roof, the best-built outbuilding in the settlement. He had filled it before the swarm with sacks of wheat and oats bought at low summer prices from families who needed cash. After the swarm, those sacks became the most valuable commodity in Nobles County. Thorn sold flour at 3 times the pre-swarm price. He sold oats at 4 times. He sold on credit, which meant he sold on debt, which meant every sack that left his shed added a line to his ledger and another link in the chain that bound families to his store. But the shed had a problem that Thorn's ledger could not fix. The plank walls had gaps, not large, but large enough for mice, and for locusts, and for the particular species of grain weevil that followed stored wheat the way flies followed meat. Thorn had not protected the seams. He had not sealed the gaps with mud or tar or cloth. He had not set traps or kept cats or done anything that a man who understood grain storage would have done, because Thorn understood prices, not grain. He understood the number in the ledger, not the thing on the shelf. By October, the damage was visible. Sacks near the walls were fouled, mouse droppings in the flour, weevil trails in the oats, a sour smell that meant moisture had followed the insects through the gaps. Thorn discovered the loss when a customer opened a sack and found a mouse nest woven into the grain, the young still alive and squirming. He lost a quarter of his stores, not to the swarm, not to the locusts, to the same carelessness he had mocked in others, the failure to protect what mattered at the margins before the threat arrived. Families heard about the fouled grain the way they heard about everything, through talk. And the talk did what Thorn's talk had done to Ira. It traveled faster than fact and arrived heavier than truth. By the second week of October, women who had been buying Thorn's flour at inflated prices began asking whether the sacks were clean. Thorn assured them they were, but the assurance rang hollow from a man whose shed smelled of mouse urine and whose prices had already cost families their savings. And the families had options now. Not many. Not enough. But Ira's ducks were laying, and Nora was trading eggs for labor, and Clara Foss had turnips, and Went had turnips, and between the eggs and the root vegetables and the 13 bushels of wheat that Ira had threshed and stored in a sealed bin with duck pens around its base, there was enough. Enough to bargain. Enough to walk past Thorn's counter and keep walking. Thorn came to Ira's fence on a Thursday in late October. He did not come with his ledger. He did not come with his buggy. He walked, which Ira had never seen him do, and he stood at the fence with his hands at his sides and his clean collar wilted from the walk, and an expression on his face that was not humility. Thorn did not possess humility, but the particular tightness of a man who was about to do something that cost him more than money. "I need ducks," Thorn said. Ira was mending a hurdle. He did not look up. For what purpose? For the shed, for the grain, the mice, and the weevils. Thorn stopped. He looked at the ducks in the nearest lane, at Liddy running the whistle, at the system that he had called feathers when flour was needed. "I need ducks for the grain shed. The birds will eat the insects." "They will eat the insects if you build lanes inside the shed and rotate the birds so they do not foul the grain sacks." "I do not know how to build lanes." "No," Ira said, "you do not." The silence lasted long enough for both men to feel it. "I will give you 6 birds," Ira said. 3 hens, 3 drakes. Weak ones. They need feeding before they are useful. You build the lanes yourself. I will show you the pattern once. After that, it is your problem." "How much?" Thorn asked. The question was reflex. Everything in Thorn's world had a price. "No charge, but you build the lanes and you build them right, and you clean the pens every day, and you do not tell me the birds do not work when the problem is that you did not work." Thorn's jaw moved. Something behind his eyes fought the words he was hearing. The raw fact that the man he had tried to buy out was now giving him something for free, and that the gift was not generosity, but a verdict. "They work better," Ira said, "when the man holding the pan knows he was wrong." Thorn took the ducks. He built lanes inside his grain shed, crude ones, poorly lashed with gaps that Ira would have fixed in 10 minutes, but that Thorn would have to learn to fix himself. The ducks worked the shed floor for 3 weeks, and the weevil population dropped to nothing, and the mice moved to easier feeding grounds. Thorn did not thank Ira. He did not apologize. He adjusted his prices downward by 10% and said nothing about ducks or feathers or flour again. It was not redemption. It was arithmetic. The same arithmetic that had driven Thorn to exploit the swarm now drove him to use the tool that had survived it. He could not be humbled, but he could be corrected. And correction for a man like Thorn was as close to justice as the settlement would ever get. Nora Dinsmore and Ira Bellamy did not fall in love. That is not how it happened, and saying it that way would make the story smaller than it was. What happened was work, shared work, repeated work, the daily labor of two claims that bordered each other and two families that needed things the other had. Ira had ducks and knowledge and a system. Nora had sons who could carry and dig and build, and she had a practical intelligence that caught mistakes before they became failures, and she had the particular stubbornness of a woman who had survived a husband's death and a swarm's destruction, and was not going to be defeated by anything as manageable as another human being. They worked together through the fall. Nora's boys helped Ira roof the sod house. The fourth wall finally finished, the turf laid tight, the interior dry for the first time since Ira had broken ground. Ira repaired Nora's well sweep, which had cracked during the swarm when she had been drawing water too fast, and the crank had sheared under pressure. He replaced the crank with a piece of oak that Pike donated, and he set it so the bucket dropped straight and the rope did not fray on the stone lip. They shared meals when it made sense, which was most evenings, because cooking for 5 cost only slightly more than cooking for 2, and the children ate better when the food was shared. Liddy and Caleb argued about the ducks. Caleb thought the cayugas were the best workers. Liddy insisted the mottled birds were smarter, and Owen sat between them eating potatoes and saying nothing, which was his preferred contribution to most conversations. Ira noticed that Nora corrected his lane angles without asking permission. He noticed that she checked the duck pens every morning before he reached them, and that she moved the water pans to positions that were better than the ones he had chosen. He noticed that she never told him what to do, but simply did the better thing and waited for him to see it. He noticed these things the way a man notices weather, slowly, then all at once, until the pattern was so obvious that pretending not to see it would have been its own kind of lie. Nora noticed that Ira taught without humiliating. She had watched him show the Went family the lane system, and she had watched him correct Clara Foss's chicken rotation, and in both cases he had pointed to the mistake and shown the fix without making the person feel smaller for having made the error. She had known men who taught by diminishing. Ira taught by standing beside. By November, the shared work had become shared planning. They discussed the spring planting as a single operation. His acres and her acres, his ducks and her chickens, his seed wheat and her seed potatoes. They discussed it sitting at Ira's table with a lamp between them and the children asleep, and the ducks murmuring in the pens outside. And at some point the discussion stopped being about farming and became about the particular future that two people build when they have decided, without saying it, that the future is shared. They married in the spring of 1875 in a ceremony at the settlement church that Pike attended, and Thorn did not. Liddy wore a dress Nora had sewn from traded cloth. Caleb held the ring. Owen stood in the back and said nothing, which was perfect. The years after compress the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work continues, but the fear does not. The duck flock grew. By the second summer, Ira kept 240 birds, the original survivors plus hatchlings from the spring clutch. He supplied eggs and ducklings to 6 families. By the third summer, 4 farms kept their own flocks, and the lane system had been adapted for oats, corn, and garden plots. The hopper barrels became standard equipment. Every family built them, every family emptied them, and the insect feed supplemented poultry diets across the settlement. The locusts returned. They returned in 1875 and 1876 and 1877, each year a smaller swarm, each year met by a larger network of lanes and trenches and flocks. Not every farm was saved. Not every family survived. The Wendt family lost their corn in '76 when a swarm arrived before the lanes were ready. A family south of Nora's abandoned their claim after 3 consecutive years of damage. The method was not a miracle. It was a margin. The difference between losing everything and losing most things but keeping enough. Ira proved up the claim. The homestead became his bush, 160 acres of Minnesota prairie that he had earned with 3 years and 4 months of Army service and 2 years of labor that had aged him faster than the war had. His hair went gray before 40. His knee never improved. He walked with a cane that Nora's boys had carved from a piece of ash, and on bad mornings he leaned on it hard enough to leave marks in the dirt. But the field stayed planted. The ducks moved through the lanes every summer, guided by whistles that sounded across the claims at dawn, a thin music that the settlement learned to hear without noticing. Liddy grew into the best flock handler in the county, faster than Ira, steadier than Nora, with a whistle technique she had learned from Marit and refined into something that was entirely her own. She could move 200 birds through a 10-lane rotation in under an hour, and she could read a flock the way Pike read wheat, by feel, by instinct, by the particular knowledge that comes from having done a thing so many times that the doing disappears, and only the knowing remains. Ira became known in the settlement, but not the way he expected. He was not the man who saved wheat. Saving wheat was one season's work, and seasons passed. He was the man who taught people to watch the edges of a field, to look where the damage started, not where it ended, to put the defense at the margin, where a small effort could prevent a large loss, instead of at the center, where a large effort could not prevent anything. That was Merritt's lesson, carried forward in a tin whistle and 100 decisions about where to place a hurdle. There is a morning in every long story where the weight of what happened settles into the landscape and becomes part of the ground. For Ira Bellamy, that morning came in the summer of 1878, when the locusts did not return. The Rocky Mountain locust swarms that had devastated the Great Plains for 5 consecutive years simply stopped. The egg beds failed, the hatches thinned, the clouds that had darkened the sky from Kansas to Minnesota broke apart and did not reform. Scientists would later argue about why. Changes in breeding grounds, shifts in wind patterns, the plowing of egg beds by expanding farmland. But the settlers did not need the explanation. They needed the silence. And the silence came. Ira stood in his field that summer morning, Marit's whistle in his pocket, and listened to the ducks work a lane that no longer needed working. The birds moved through the wheat margin in their familiar rotation, whistle, pan, tap, forward. But the lane floor was clean. No insects, no nymphs, no outriders on the fence posts, just dirt and stubble, and the sound of duckbills finding nothing and moving on. He did not disband the flock. The ducks had become more than a defense. They were eggs and meat and barter goods, and the particular pride of a claim that had been built on something everyone else had laughed at. They were Liddy's responsibility, and Caleb's morning chore, and Owen's excuse to be outside instead of at the table. They were the thing that had turned Ira Bellamy from a man with a limp and a half-built house into a man whose fence people walked to. Marit Haugen died in the winter of 1877. She died in her sod house, alone, with her geese outside and her cow already gone. Nora found her when the chimney smoke stopped. She was sitting in her chair with her hands in her lap and her boots on, as if she had been about to leave for somewhere and had simply decided to stay. Ira buried her beside her husband on her claim. He put the tin whistle on the grave marker, a wooden cross that Peter the Swede had carved with Marit's name and her years, and then he took it back, because Marit would not have wanted a whistle sitting in the rain when it could be teaching a duck to walk a lane. The method spread by demonstration the way Marit said it would. Whistle, lane, water, shade, rotation. No pamphlet, no patent. Just neighbors walking fields together in the early mornings, counting how much damage they could prevent before the insects lifted. By 1876, families outside the settlement had heard about it. By 1877, a man from Blue Earth County rode 2 days to see the lanes and rode 2 days back with drawings and measurements and 6 duck eggs wrapped in straw. Ira Bellamy lived out his years on the same quarter section he had almost abandoned the summer he bought 200 dying ducks from a station platform. The limp worsened until the cane became a second leg. His fields never became rich. 160 acres of southwestern Minnesota prairie was not a path to wealth, not in the 1870s, not ever. But they stayed planted. Every summer, the duck pens moved before the grain heads filled, and every autumn there was enough. Enough to eat, enough to seed, enough to share. He died on the claim in the house Nora's boys had roofed, with Liddy's whistle hanging by the door. Bennett Thorne had said it first, and the settlement had carried it forward like a song everyone knew the words to. Bellamy bought feathers when he needed flour. The line was meant to bury a man. Instead, it became the answer to its own question. On Ira's table, the morning after the swarm that ate every stalk on every claim from the road to the river, there sat a flour sack ground from wheat that ducks had saved, and beside it a bowl of eggs laid by birds no one had wanted, and outside the door 200 ducks moving through the dawn grass toward the lanes. Not a miracle, not magic, not even an invention, but hunger turned in the right direction, aimed at the margin, walking forward because a whistle told them something was waiting.